The croissant hit Margot Bellamy square in the nose. Not gently, not accidentally. The full, flaky, butter-drenched thing launched off the cooling rack like it had somewhere important to be, bounced off the edge of the prep table, and found her face with the kind of precision that should have required training. She stood there for a moment, flour on her cheek, a smear of almond paste on her chin, and stared at the rack like it owed her an apology. "Gerald," she said quietly, "we've talked about this." Gerald, the ancient convection oven in the back left corner of Bellamy's bakehouse, clicked twice in response. That was Gerald's version of a shrug. He'd been clicking like that for 11 years, ever since Margot's mother had bought him secondhand from a restaurant that was closing down in Cincinnati. He had a broken seal on his left door, a thermostat that ran 8 degrees hot on Tuesdays specifically, and a habit of rattling the cooling rack at the worst possible moments. Margot wiped the almond paste from her chin, picked the croissant up off the floor, and put it in the staff basket. Waste not. The girls in the front would eat anything that landed on the clean tile, and the tile in this kitchen was the cleanest thing Margot owned. She had been up since 3:45. It was now 6:12. In 48 minutes, the front door of Bellamy's Bakehouse would open on the corner of Elm and Crestwood in Harlow, Ohio, and the morning line would begin. Margot knew this without looking at the clock because her body had been keeping that schedule for 4 years, ever since her mother's hands got bad enough that the early shifts fell to her. She pulled another tray from the rack, carefully this time with both hands, giving Gerald no opportunities, and began arranging the morning pastries in the glass case near the window. The bakehouse smelled like brown sugar and cardamom and something warm that Margot had never been able to name. Customers tried to name it all the time. One woman from Cleveland had once stood in the doorway for a full 30 seconds and said, "It smells like a grandmother who actually liked you." Margot had written that one down. She didn't notice the man who came in with the first wave of morning customers. That wasn't unusual. The first wave was always dense. The pre-work crowd, the regulars who timed their commute around a coffee and a cheese Danish, the retired men who had nowhere to be but came anyway. Margot was behind the case, filling the almond croissant gap that Gerald had created, when her part-time counter help, a 19-year-old named Becca who was saving for nursing school, leaned over and said, "The guy in the gray jacket, he's been looking at everything for like 4 minutes." Margot glanced up. Gray jacket, mid-30s maybe, dark hair. He was standing in front of the case with his hands in his pockets, and he was not doing what most people did, which was look at what was closest to them and point. He was reading the labels, all of them, slowly, the way someone reads a menu in a restaurant where they've never been and aren't sure if they can trust it yet. "Help him," Margot said. "I tried." He said he was still deciding. Margot went back to the croissants. She didn't think about him again for another 20 minutes, by which point the line had thinned and she was restocking the brioche shelf, and she noticed, without meaning to, that he was still there. Not at the counter. At the small table by the window, the one with the wobbly leg she kept meaning to fix, with a coffee, and what appeared to be a plain butter croissant, and he was writing something in a small notebook. Nobody wrote in notebooks at Bellamy's. They looked at their phones, they talked to each other. Occasionally, they talked to Margot's mother, Eleanor Bellamy, who had started coming in on Tuesday and Thursday mornings again now that the weather was warmer and her hands cooperated more. Eleanor had a gift for making strangers talk to her. She would simply look at someone with that particular patient expression of hers and people would start telling her things. Margot didn't have that gift. She had Gerald. The man with the notebook came back the next day. Same time, same table. Coffee, plain butter croissant, notebook. This time he stayed for an hour and a half. Margot tracked him the way she tracked anything unusual in her kitchen, not with alarm, just attention. On the third day, when he was standing at the counter and Becca was out back on her break, Margot helped him herself. "Same as yesterday?" she asked. He looked up. He had very direct eyes. Not unfriendly, just direct. "You remember," he said. "I remember everyone's order after day 2, Margot said. "It's a small bakery. What would you like?" "The same," he said, and he looked at the case. "What's the thing with the blackberries?" "The flat one, galette, blackberry lemon." "The curd is made here. I'll try that too." His name, she found out 3 days later, because he paid cash the first 4 times and it was Eleanor who finally asked, was Donovan Reed. He told Eleanor this while Margot was in the back coaxing Gerald through the second proof on a batch of sourdough. Eleanor came back with the information like she'd found a $20 bill on the sidewalk. "His name is Donovan," she announced, settling into her stool by the prep table. "Who?" "The notebook man." Margot did not look up from the dough. Why did you ask him? Because I wanted to know. Eleanor picked a stray blueberry off the counter and ate it. He's very polite. He asked about the oven. This gave Margot pause. She looked up. What about the oven? He asked how old it was. I told him Gerald was practically family. She paused. He wrote something down. Margot looked at Gerald. Gerald clicked. Stop encouraging him, she told the oven. Eleanor watched her for a moment. You know, she said, most people would be curious. I'm curious about my hydration ratios, Margot said. I'm curious about whether the blackberry yield is going to hold through July. I'm not curious about men who write things down in notebooks. You should be, Eleanor said simply, and got up to go rearrange the front window display, which was her way of ending a conversation she'd already won. What Margot didn't know, what she had no way of knowing because men who came to small bakeries in Harlow, Ohio, with notebooks and direct eyes didn't typically announce themselves, was that Donovan Reed was the majority stakeholder and acting CEO of Hartwell Provisions Group, a food and hospitality company based out of Columbus that had acquired 11 regional bakeries in the past 4 years. He was in Harlow because his acquisitions director had flagged Bellamy's Bakehouse in a market survey. Small footprint, loyal customer base, revenue that punched above its weight for a single location operation. Potential acquisition target, the survey said. Donovan's system was simple. Before he made any offer, he visited the business himself, not as a CEO, as a customer. He'd been doing it since the second acquisition, after the first one went sideways because he'd relied entirely on numbers and walked into a place with excellent books and a staff that hated each other so thoroughly that the whole thing collapsed within 18 months of signing. So he showed up. He paid cash. He watched. What he had not expected in Harlow, at a table with a wobbly leg, with a cup of coffee and a pastry that was, he had to admit, the best thing he'd put in his mouth in recent memory, was to find himself genuinely reluctant to finish the observation phase. He'd observed 11 bakeries. He had never had this problem before. The problem, if he was being precise, was that the bakery was run in a way that made no operational sense on paper and complete sense in reality. The woman, Margot, he'd gathered, because the older woman called her that, and the teenager called her that, and a man named Phil who came in every morning and ordered a raisin scone called her that while asking her opinion on his tomato plants, ran every element of the morning operation herself. The baking, the inventory, the vendor calls, which he heard portions of while pretending to read. She had 2 part-time counter staff and a Thursday delivery help named someone he hadn't caught. She did not have a POS system that made any sense. She had a handwritten sheet behind the counter that she updated with a pen. She was also, factually, a remarkable baker. He'd eaten here 7 mornings running. Everything was consistent, not in the mass-produced way, in the way that meant someone was paying very close attention every single day. He had also, he noted in his notebook, never once seen her stop moving. The problem escalated on day 8. He'd arrived at his usual time, taken his usual table, ordered his usual coffee, this time with a slice of what turned out to be an apple and brown butter tart that made him sit very still for a moment after the first bite, and opened his notebook. He'd been there about 20 minutes when he heard a voice at the back of the shop, near the counter, get louder. A man in a jacket that probably cost more than Margot's monthly revenue was standing at the counter. He was not in line. He had come in through the side entrance, the one marked staff only, and he was now standing near the register with the expression of someone who owned things and was used to that being sufficient explanation. Donovan recognized the type immediately, in the particular way that you recognize a thing you've seen in the mirror. He couldn't hear everything. The morning ambient noise swallowed the lower registers, but he caught enough. Corporate account. We've discussed this before, Eleanor. Eleanor, at her stool, was not looking at the man. She was looking at her coffee cup with tremendous serenity. I don't recall that conversation, Howard, she said pleasantly. The man, Howard, made a gesture that suggested Eleanor's memory was the problem. The terms were reasonable. We've given Bellamy's every opportunity to. Margot came out of the back. She had flour on her forearm and she was carrying a tray, and she set it down on the counter with a quiet, deliberate exactness that Donovan had started to notice she used when she was calibrating something. Howard, she said, not a greeting, a fact. Howard turned to her with the energy of a man who had been waiting for the person he actually wanted to talk to. Margot, look, I've been patient, but the Crestwood development is moving forward and the offer on the table hasn't changed, Margot said. And neither has my answer. The lease is up in November. I know when my lease is up. The building is being sold regardless. The development company has nothing to do with me until November, said. Her voice was level, not cold. Just level, the way the prep table was level, something carefully maintained. And if you come in through the staff entrance again, I'm going to ask you to leave. Howard looked at her for a long moment. He had the particular expression of a man deciding whether it was worth escalating with someone who was clearly not going to give him the reaction he wanted. Evidently, he decided it wasn't, because he adjusted his jacket and left through the front door. The shop was very quiet for a moment. Then Gerald clicked. Eleanor said, "Oh, hush, Gerald," and went back to her coffee. Becca, from behind the counter, said, "That guy gives me the creeps." Margot picked up her tray. "He gives himself the creeps," she said, and went back to the kitchen. Donovan sat at his wobbly table and wrote 3 words in his notebook: "Find out who." He found out that afternoon through his real estate contact in Columbus, Howard Price, development liaison for the Crestwood Group, which was in the process of buying an entire block of downtown Harlow, the corner of Elm and Crestwood included, to build what their press materials called a mixed-use lifestyle destination, which was a sentence Donovan had learned meant they were going to knock things down. He read the file twice. Then he did something he hadn't done since the 3rd acquisition, which was make a decision before the observation phase was technically complete. He made a call. He came in the next morning later than usual after the rush had thinned. Margot was at the front counter doing inventory, running her pen down the handwritten sheet with the focused expression she got when she was doing math. She didn't look up. "The galette," she said. "We're out. Gerald had a disagreement with the oven temperature and I lost a batch." Donovan stopped. "Gerald, the oven," she said, still writing. "Don't ask." He sat down at his usual table. He ordered coffee. He waited. When the rush was done and Becca had gone on break and Eleanor had gone to her Tuesday water aerobics class, a detail he knew because Eleanor had told him about it while he was pretending to read, Margot came out with a damp cloth and began wiping down the counter. "I know you're not just a customer," she said. She said it the same way she'd said Howard, a fact. Donovan was quiet for a moment. "What gave it away?" "The notebook," she said. "Regular customers don't take notes, and you were watching the operation, not just sitting." She turned to look at him directly. The directness was mutual. He'd noticed that about her from the first morning. She looked at things straight on, the way people do when they've stopped hoping they'll like what they see and decided they'd rather just know. "Also, Gerald doesn't like most people. He's been behaving himself since you got here." Donovan glanced at the oven in the back. The oven clicked. He looked back at Margot. "My name is Donovan Reed. I'm the CEO of Hartwell Provisions Group. We acquire and support regional food businesses. Your bakery came up in a market survey." The cloth in Margot's hand stopped moving. "I'm not here to pressure you," he said. "I want you to know what I actually do. I've watched 11 businesses before making an offer. 6 took the offer, 3 declined, 2 I walked away from on my own. And us?" Margot said. "I haven't decided yet." The honesty surprised her. He could see that. She looked at him for a moment in the way she sometimes looked at Gerald. Not with warmth exactly, not yet, but with attention. "Why not?" she said. "Because," Donovan said carefully, "you're running something I don't fully understand yet. And I've learned not to make offers on things I don't understand." She was quiet. Outside, a car passed on Elm Street. The morning light was doing something particular to the front window. The kind of thing that happens in old buildings where the glass is slightly uneven and bends the light into shapes nobody planned. "My mother built this place," Margot said finally. "She opened it when I was 9. I started working the counter at 12. She handed it to me 4 years ago when her rheumatoid arthritis got bad enough that she couldn't manage the early hours." She picked up the cloth and resumed wiping. "I'm not interested in selling. I'm not necessarily asking you to sell," Donovan said. She looked at him. "Partnership," he said. "Not acquisition. Hartwell has 3 bakeries operating under a partnership model. The owners keep operational control. We provide infrastructure, better POS systems, supply chain access, legal and real estate resources." He paused. "Resources like someone who can tell Howard Price that the lease on this building isn't something the Crestwood Group has any claim on until November, and that Bellamy's Bakehouse has options." Something shifted in her expression. Not softening exactly. Recalibrating. "You looked into Howard," she said. "I looked into the situation," he said. "I did that before I came back this morning." "Why?" He considered the question. In 11 businesses, nobody had asked him why before. They asked what and how much and what's the catch, but not why. "Because," he said, "you told a man who clearly had leverage to leave through the front door, and then you went back and made pastry. And I wanted to understand what kind of person does that." Margot looked at him for a long moment. "Gerald," she said finally, not looking away from Donovan. "What do you think?" Gerald clicked twice. "That's what I thought." She pulled out a chair at his table and sat down. They talked for 2 hours. About the lease first. Donovan had already had his real estate attorney in Columbus start pulling the relevant documents, and the news was better than Margot knew. The Crestwood Group had a right of first refusal on the building, but not until the current lease expired, and the building's owner had been dragging his feet on the sale. There was a window. Possibly a long window. Possibly long enough to do something real with. About the partnership structure, second. Margot asked questions that were sharper than he expected and stopped him twice when she thought he was being vague on purpose. He wasn't. The first time he'd just assumed she had context she didn't have, and he adjusted. The second time she was right that he'd glossed over a detail, and he said so. Eleanor came back from water aerobics at noon. She walked in, looked at the two of them at the table, looked at the 2 empty coffee cups, and looked at Gerald. Gerald clicked. "Good," Eleanor said, and went to put her bag away. The official meeting, the one with Donovan's attorney and Margot's accountant, a very calm woman named Patricia who wore reading glasses on a chain and did not seem impressed by anyone, happened 2 weeks later. It lasted 4 hours. Patricia asked questions that made Donovan's attorney go slightly pale twice, which in Donovan's experience was a sign of good representation. Margot sat through it the way she stood at her prep table, still attentive, not rushing anything. At the end, Patricia took off her reading glasses, set them on the chain, and looked at Margot. Margot looked at the document in front of her. Then she looked at Donovan. "You came back the next day," she said. "After Howard. You didn't have to." "I know," he said. "Why did you?" It was the same question she'd asked at the table 2 weeks ago, the same directness. "Because I sat in your bakery for 8 days, Donovan said, "and I ate the best pastry I've had in 15 years of visiting food businesses, and I watched you run a kitchen that should not function as well as it does on the resources you have, and I wanted to understand it." He paused. "I think I understand it now." "What is it?" she said. "You actually care," he said, "about the thing itself. The bread, the galette, the croissant." He glanced at Gerald. "Even the oven." "Gerald is not a thing," Eleanor said from the counter, without looking up. "Gerald is not a thing," Donovan confirmed. Something in Margot's face did what it had never quite done in 8 days of observation. It let go of a little of the careful steadiness and became something else. Not soft exactly, just open. The way a window is open on the first genuinely warm morning after a long Ohio winter. She picked up the pen. She signed. Patricia made a small approving sound and gathered her papers. The Crestwood Group's option on the building, as it turned out, fell through in August. The building's owner, a 73-year-old man named Carl, who had owned the block since the 80s and had been on the fence about selling for 3 years, decided he wasn't interested in having his properties turned into a lifestyle destination. Hartwell's real estate team had not discouraged him from this conclusion. The lease was renewed. The corner of Elm and Crestwood stayed exactly as it was. Donovan came back to Harlow in September officially for the first partnership check-in. The new POS system had been installed the week before. Margot had spent 2 hours learning it and then spent another hour explaining it to Becca, who had spent that hour taking notes in a very small notebook. "She's going to be a good nurse," Margot said, watching Becca through the front window. "She's going to be a terrifying one," Donovan said, and Margot laughed, really laughed, the way she didn't usually, the quick, unguarded kind. He noted that in his notebook later, not as a data point, just because he wanted to. Eleanor noticed because Eleanor noticed everything. She said nothing about it for exactly 3 weeks, which was 2 weeks and 6 days longer than Donovan would have predicted. When she finally said something, it was a Tuesday, and she said it to Gerald. "You knew," she told the oven, settling onto her stool with her coffee. "Didn't you?" Gerald clicked. "Of course you did," Eleanor said. The thing Margot found out in November, which she had not known, which Donovan had not told her because it hadn't seemed like the right moment, and then the right moment kept not arriving, was that he had 3 older brothers and a father who had expected him to take over the family hardware business in Dayton, and that he had spent a significant portion of his early 20s feeling like someone who was very good at understanding value in things and very bad at being understood himself. She found this out not because he told her, but because his oldest brother showed up at the November check-in, apparently under the impression that it was optional for him to be invited, and spent 45 minutes in Bellamy's front room telling Eleanor the family history, while Donovan sat at the wobbly table with the expression of a man who had stopped trying to control that particular situation some years ago. His brother's name was Patrick. He ate 4 rugalac and talked for 45 minutes and said, at the end, to Margot, "He talks about this place like it's the best bakery in the state," which, for Donovan, means he's half in love with it. He paused. He's not actually great at saying that kind of thing directly. Just so you know. Margot looked at Donovan. Donovan looked at the table. Gerald, across the room, clicked 3 times. Patrick looked at the oven. Does it always do that? Always, Margot said. Donovan looked up from the table. There was a moment that was not quite comfortable and not quite uncomfortable. The kind that sits between 2 people when something true has just been said out loud and both of them are deciding what to do about it. The rugelach, Donovan said finally, is better than the one we served at the Columbus location. I've been trying to figure out why. Brown butter in the dough, Margot said. And I rested overnight. Can I watch sometime? The overnight rest is between 2 and 5 in the morning, she said. I know, he said. I read the production schedule. Patrick looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at her coffee cup with the serene expression of someone watching a very long movie reach its final act. Gerald, Eleanor said quietly, I think we're going to be just fine. The oven clicked once. Warm and sure, the way something sounds when it has been right about a thing from the very beginning.